Good evening. Yeah, my name is Dalia Habib Linssen. I'm the head of academic engagement at the MFA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation that is inspired by the exhibition Ancient Nubia Now. Our panel discussion explores how shifting conceptions of ancient African past have informed contemporary notions of cultural identity from a variety of perspectives. So we're thrilled to have three wonderful speakers tonight, which I will introduce individually, who will share their thoughts about the relationship of the Ancient Nubia exhibition and the contemporary complexities of identity and practice. And then we will have an opportunity for a panel discussion and invite questions, comments, and observations. So to begin, since 1969, Edmund Gaither has been director and curator of the Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists and special consultant at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gaither. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
This is a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the relationship that art can give us to history and place. So it's in that framework that I want to make the following remarks. From their arrival in America, African Americans have sought to strengthen their identity and establish a lineage comparable to that other Americans hold. Africa has been the obvious connection, since it is from that continent that most Black Americans have come. Over the years, African Americans have been called all kinds of things: Africans, Afro-Americans, Afro-Americans, Negroes, colored, and now Blacks, African Americans, or people of color. These names were prevalent at different periods of time, largely in relationship to socio-political or socio-cultural movements. For example, Black came to be widely used in the era of cultural nationalism associated with Black power and post-colonial struggles. At the center of Black cultural awareness has always been the reclamation of ancient Nubia and Egypt as symbolic legacies of Black Americans. The focus on Nubia and Egypt recalls for us that in the ancient world, several terms were used interchangeably. For example, Nubian and Ethiopian may both appear describing Black people in the Nile Valley. Into that same category of darker people might appear Cushites and Abyssinians. Thus, many references occurring in spiritual, biblical, or classical text may present present-day Sudan as Nubia. For Black Americans, the distinctions are not so important, since Nubian often simply means African. Symbols from ancient Egypt and Nubia have been embraced in Black popular culture as well as by Black artistic culture. Consider, for example, 2 for Sheikh by Dr. Jeff Donaldson. The seriograph is an homage to Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese scholar, linguist, and scientist, who advanced his belief that there was an underlying cultural unity in Africa, as well as holding a deep interest in Africa's pre-colonial history. Among the most influential of his books were African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, and The Cultural Unity of Black Africa. Picking up on these themes, 2 for Sheikh is anchored by the Egyptian symbol of the scarab, signifying rebirth or resurrection. flanking the scarab of the sun and the moon expressed as women. Subsuming everything are patterns drawn from West and Central African cultures. While Egypt and Nubia are referenced, this work is more deeply rooted in the thought of the Afro-Koba group, to which Jeff Donaldson belonged, which asserted that Black Americans were an African people. The process of reclamation of the Nile Valley as a Black symbolic legacy stretches far into the past. As early as 1876, Black sculptor Edmund Lewis created Death of Cleopatra in marble. Though Cleopatra was Ptolemaic and Greek, she nevertheless is presented as Queen of the Nile and thus part of Egypt's Black heritage. Lewis extended her own personal world through her art, capturing in the Egyptian queen both the power of Egypt and the power of womanhood. In another work, she renders Abraham's rejected wife Hagar, who's said to have been also Nubian, with more specifically Black features. Much of the discussion of ancient Egypt and Nubia focused on physical traits. Frequently, these discussions did not distinguish sharply between the two peoples. In either case, some figurative works with facial features, hair textures, or stylistic elements suggest Blackness in some of these works. African Americans saw aspects of themselves, thus in the representation of Nubian and Egyptian art. This dynamic is observed in Ethiopia Awakening, circa 1914. Black sculptor Mida Warwick Fuller gives her mummy rounded features. The awakening woman anticipates the awakening of the sleeping giant, that is, of Africa rising again. Thus, at the end of the 20th century, Fuller's Ethiopia heralds a Pan-African, pan-colonial arising throughout the Black world. Even as George Reisner's expedition in Nubia progressed, anti-colonial feelings were rising in the breast of Africans. Not until Ghana became independent in 1957 would the promise of that start be fulfilled. The increased energy devoted to African rebirth and its claim to the ancient Nile Valley are everywhere evident. In the work of Lois Mailou Jones, a non-political artist, we see this theme expressed in Ascent of Ethiopia, completed in 1932. Here the Nubian queen appears with a procession of Black people moving towards full realization of themselves through the arts. They dance, sing, make movies, and act on the way to creating jazz and other forms that would radically alter 20th century global culture. As pyramids, images of pharaohs or their queens, and other similar designs proliferated, and as lectures and other presentations reinterpreting the history of ancient Africa spread, the Nile Valley assumed even greater importance and popularity. Following World War II, new prominence was given to assessing Nubia and Egypt. The understanding of those cultures needed correction. Fresh perspectives would change the study of Egypt and Nubia. Meanwhile, at the level of popular and artistic culture, the view of Africa was clear. In 1968, Gary Rickson here in Boston painted this mural on the wall of the newly built Roxbury YMCA. Africa is the beginning was among the first of the murals in Boston responding to the nationwide impact of Chicago's Wall of Respect. Over recent decades, new perspectives on ancient Africa have emerged. These understandings assert that Egyptian civilization was indebted to Africa, including Nubia, for some of its formative ideas, and that Egyptian civilization provided much of the foundation for Greco-Roman civilization. Proceeding from this approach, Africa, Black Africa, the interior of Africa, becomes not just the home of the earliest humans, but also the birthplace of civilization. Amid these changes in scholarship, the Museum of Fine Arts commits to showcasing its extraordinary Nubian holdings. In 1991, it opened galleries dedicated to Nubian art and artifacts. The Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists praised that action and committed to creating a complementary Nubian exhibition that became Aspelta, a Nubian king's burial chamber. In this view of that exhibition, you see an exceedingly accurate recreation of Aspelta's burial chamber and the cast of his sarcophagus. In another view, you see the recreated coffin of Aspelta as rendered by the Barbadian artist Carlos Stewart. Appreciating the glorious heritage that Nubia represents as an aspect of African-American symbolic heritage, there is no more handsome a testament than John Biggar's mural, Nubia Commerce. This work was commissioned for the business school at Texas Southern University. Nubia brings together a complex iconography that synthesizes African icons and stories from across the continent and bathes them in the light of Nubian gold. Beyond the specific interest in Nubia and Africa, African Americans embraced Africa as a generalized ancestral legacy. Some changed their names to West African names, Swahili names, or Arabic names. Still others adopted wearing African or African-inspired garments, motifs, and hairstyles. Ranging from boobas to geles, young blacks donned colorful outfits that proclaimed their awakening. Unks became ever-present. A number of women, under the influence of the adage, black is beautiful, began to wear their hair in African-inspired coiffures, just as many men wore popular African-inspired hairstyles such as afros and locks. In sum, the sum of these influences creates a social, cultural, and political space in which a movement, such as that one to name Dudley Square as Nubian Square, could take place and could fire the popular imagination. You perhaps know this is a current political effort, and there will be a referendum in the vote in November on whether this should happen. In the same environment, references to the civilization of the ancient Nile Valley have been normalized and are fully at home in ordinary black communities, such as is the case with this guy strolling by the mural by Heidi Stork and Youth of Roxbury, which was executed on the side of the Walgreens on Warren Street. There for you to go and see anytime. Those are a few thoughts on this theme. Frankly, the theme is so broad that one could go a million directions, but you don't have enough time for that. So we'll call this done.
Thank you, Barry. Our next speaker, Chester Higgins, is an award-winning photographer. Chester's going to show us a selection of his photographs, so please join me in welcoming Chester Higgins. Thank you so much, Chester. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Good afternoon. My work, like so many African Americans who are Afrocentric in our outlook is looking at or exploring the many dimensions of our ancestral identity. And I did a book years ago on the African diaspora, looking at not only the migration in the continent itself, but what I call the secondary migration across the Atlantic Ocean, and then tertiary migration back to the colonial capitals. And the book was called Feeling the Spirit. Recently, a few years ago, I co-authored a book called Ancient Nubia that pulls from actually my archive of looking at the trek of African people along the Blue Nile. Because the Blue Nile has been central to migration. All the rivers have been central to migrations, but the Blue Nile especially has been central to the migration of sacred imagination and thought that gave us our earliest concepts of religion and faith. And there's a world that I call the world before Genesis, which is the world of the sky and nature, and the Abrahamic faith. And what I've looked at for decades is how I've been amazed at how we, people of African descent, not only have visualized or been very sensitive to the whole spiritual world, but also how we have physicalized our belief in the spiritual world, and how we essentially given birth to that for future generations, including ours that we live in. So, but this what I'm showing you tonight only deals with Nubia. But to me, as in all my photography of antiquity sites or dealing with cognitive behaviors, is looking at the things that are left behind and what those things say about the people who left them there. And this is from Merowe, the necropolis, the royal necropolis of Merowe, and is looking at out through a temple, the front of a temple at the rising sun that comes over. And from my research in ancient Egypt, what people would do is that the worshipers would come before sunrise and gather, facing the sun. And then and the pillars of the sun would rise up in those pillars, and that would be their high for the day. And that was brought home to me when I traveled to Ethiopia a lot, and that the Ethiopians follow the same daily calendar where people come to church around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and when the sun rises, when they finish, because the promise of the new day has come, the being in touch with this calendar. And some of you who read the Bible, especially the New Testament, may recall that when Jesus was having, I think, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and one of his disciples says, I will not leave you. And he says, by the time the cock crows thrice, you would have denied me. And that speaks, not only because of my experience in Ethiopia, that I realized that speaks to that daily calendar of worship in the temples. Because if you go to Ethiopia, you will find a lot of churches and nobody is in them in the daytime when you go there, because we expect people to be at 11 o'clock. That doesn't happen. The churches are empty because they were crowded before sunrise. That does not mean, however, that there may be a special activity of a church that may require daily people to come in the daytime, but the holy hour is always before the sunrise. So here's the sun rising outside of a temple that is now a temple to a tomb in Merowe. This is the Nile, which flows out of Ethiopia, 6,000 feet above sea level, on its way down to Khartoum, to Sudan, and to Egypt. It starts at 6,000 feet above sea level in Lake Tana, and by the time it gets to the pyramids, it's 54 feet above sea level. In Sudan, I think it's about maybe 100 feet above sea level. But it's that water that brings down all of the nutrients from the mountains of Ethiopia that made Egypt and that made that whole Nile area fertile. And this is the one place at the third cataract where the Nile takes a bend. It's an early temple made out of mud called a dafufa from the Kerma time. It has, like all of the sacred buildings along the Nile in the world, it has two towers in front. It's still something that you have with Muslims. They have two towers, and sometimes Christian churches, we have still the same architectural paradigm. Here at the Temple of Amen, I know some people have called this Amun, Aman, but the reason being is that the Egyptian religion is a consonant-based, the Egyptian language is a consonant-based language, so that the Egyptians knew which vowel to drop in. And when we go back, we can see the glyphs for AMN. What we don't see is what's in the middle between the M and the N. It's not given to us. So we're left to our imagination which vowel drops in there. Is that the O vowel, the U vowel, or is it the E vowel or I vowel? But here you see the head of state in conversation and a private audience with the God Amen. This is what's left behind of so many of their pyramids. More of them are rubbles, but this is probably the one in El Kuru that you can see next to another pyramid, foundation of another pyramid that's there. And then we have the temple of Naga, the lion temple at Naga. And I want to point out something here. This is a female ruler, Kandaki, and this is her son. And this female ruler is holding his, and she's going to chop him off, just like the male rulers chop him off. For a long time, people thought this was Roman, but it's not. A German group took this apart several years ago, and they made the finding that it was no Roman architectural structure in this at all. People get confused when they see Greek and Roman architecture before seeing Egyptian architecture, without realizing that the conquest of Egypt, they had the conquerors had good taste, and they took things back that they saw in Egypt. So most of these classical buildings that you see, that usually what we would call power classical buildings, like your main library here or buildings like that, all of those it's Egyptian architecture that's been transported to another culture. And here's from Meroe, where you have hundreds of pyramids. And this is an alleyway, so to speak, where you see the chapels of these pyramids. And you look behind and you see these pyramids in rubble. That rubble was hastened in the 1800s when an Italian doctor went down with the army of Pasha, and someone had found a cache of gold, but it was buried underneath the pyramids. And he went back to England and published a big article on this, trying to find a museum to buy it. So the Pasha ambassador found out about this, and he sent an expedition down with camels loaded with dynamite to blow the tops off to try to find these chambers that were supposedly in the apex of these pyramids that never existed, but now you have this devastation. This is the interior of a pyramid in Musarat. And what I'm also showing here is how I use light. Light is a very big thing in how I construct my photographs. So in the beginning, you were seeing available light. But I do use available light early morning, late evening, which is photographer's term for golden light. But then I also use, I take to the field with me a lot of strobes, battery-powered strobes, so I can balance out when I come to problems like this, interiors where you can appreciate, because the eye can make that separation, but in terms of film, it needs help to make that separation work for you. And this is my first example here. Or using the raking late afternoon, I call it the 30 degree light, the early morning, late afternoon light, to pop out some of the, so here you have a Kandaki, a queen, have sun, and then functionaries, and then you hear the Epetamak, the god who can see all things in all ways and who has 4 arms. And here's a reconstructed pyramid, the lighter one, because you had this guy who's an architect who went and started working. A lot of what happens in Sudan is political, in the sense that when the Cold War happened, the Western scientists and archaeologists went to Egypt, which is sexier. The Eastern scientists from Poland, Czechoslovakia, what have you, went to Nubia. So you have this divide. And that's why you have more of the Germans. So more, if you wanted to find the results of these excavations, that's how it is separated. And because this guy's an architect, architects have in their DNA they must build. So this guy, thankfully so, set up a complex system where he was able then to help recollect the stones that had been blasted away by dynamite to try to reassemble some of these pyramids. So here you see the dunes ever shifting, moving inside of this huge field of pyramids. It depends on which map you look at. Some maps say there's several hundred pyramids here. There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. Egypt has almost 100 pyramids, but the pyramids in Sudan are not as big as the Egyptian pyramids. The Egyptian pyramids are more the 45-degree angle pyramids. The Nubian pyramids are 60-degree angle, and they're not as tall. And the Egyptians managed to solve the problem of interior rooms that the Nubians either did not solve or didn't want to use. And their burials are made first in the bedrock, and then the actual pyramid is made on top of that. This is doing a dusty afternoon. The sky will cooperate to help me get the great rounding of the solar orb. Still Merowe. And when I was traveling, there were no hotels near these antiquity sites and no towns. So I'd have to camp out, which meant in the desert you had to take 2 cars in case you had problems, and sometimes you did, and a satellite phone in case you had emergencies. But you were always, and your own cook and the food. But it was exciting every morning to get out of the tent after a windy night of sand to just see how the sand had marked how the wind had marked the sand. So you're looking at the wind prints from overnight when you get up. So sometimes, I use artificial light, but there are other times there's so much sun that you can use reflective light. There are these stones along the Nile, especially at the cataracts. The cataract is an impediment where a boat cannot pass. So when the Egyptians or Nubians traveled the Nile and they come upon a pediment, their boats, they would disassemble the boat. First, take everybody off, take all the stock off, disassemble the boat, and then walk all of this equipment past the cataract, reassemble the boat, reload it, and put your crew back on it and continue. So this could take, a week or so. And what you would have is along these cataracts, you would have sometimes somebody leave something like this behind. Essentially, it's a Kilroy was here. I was here during the time of this king, and this is my job, and this is what I was doing. And you find these all along the cataract, at the point of the cataracts. You'll find them either before the cataract, at the cataract, or beyond the cataract. And a lot of them, some are better than others, but they're all very interesting. And this is looking at the temple, the holiest temple of Amun in Gebel Barkal, in the mountain in Gebel Barkal, that during the time of Tahaka, and you see the king in the audience with the god Epidemic and his queen and the king's cartouches and his best on the outside, and this is going out there in the antechamber. Things like this took an awful lot of light to make work and time, going back 2 and 3 times to finally get it, and here it is. Here's another tomb that was very, very important, the tomb of Queen Kwahata, and I had to go back 3 times before I could get the picture right on this one, because the first time, I mean, there's no electricity in the tomb, and you see the watermarks where there's water damage from flooding. Her sarcophagus would have been here, and here she is tenderly being led by the Horus into the afterlife, and there she is on her bear. But when I went there, not knowing the situation, I had only my camera strobe, and that just came out like a little circle. And I went back again with these gas lights, and that really didn't work out well. So now I realized what the problem was, and I went back with enough lights to make sure that I could balance it out, this 2-chamber tomb of hers. And in this chamber of hers, just from a different direction, this is the first time I'd seen this in any tomb. I haven't seen it in any Egyptian tomb either, and I hadn't seen the image of the burial being like a sphinx when in the ceremony of oops, am I going backwards? Okay, this is the opening of the mouth ceremony with her successor doing that ceremony. This is inside a chamber, you know, the stars all above, opposite her on this side, and all the water damage. Now, this is using light where I'm fully in control. There's no ambient light. There's my light from my strobes to try to make things work from the Cartoon Museum. Here you have an Osiris marker. And so, you know, and what is it? Wakanda? What was that? Black Panthers? Yeah. This is thought of as a sign of nullification, the crossing out of the negative and positive forces. So this is the first sacred sign. You address, you salute the temple, you salute the shrine, you salute each other, you salute the priests. And here, taking a rock and trying to bring out the drama of what is telling, how do I use light essentially to help people from the past tell their story? How do I bring the drama back to it? That's really my mission. Here you have a priest, because the priests always have the garment with the leopard and or some wild animal, and you see the paws and the limbs. And then you have your Epidemic as a god angel. And then there were times I thought I should get funny with this. It is Halloween. So, you know, maybe somebody's awake in that pyramid. So I thought I'd play with this with using the night sky as a key light, and actually I had to use 2 lights, one inside to say somebody is home, and then the other one out front to let you see, to place it. But you know, you're in the desert, you got a lot of time. You're far from anywhere, from anything. So one could be, you know, have fun with it, you know. And this is an image that's used at the end of this exhibition, where it's using the silhouette of a pyramid in Merowe. And this is another example of what you can wake up to in the daytime, in the mornings after the wind has had its way with the sand. Because everything in nature has a voice, has a feeling to it. And I just like to see how things shift and what happens. And that was that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really lovely. Our final speaker tonight is an assistant professor of anthropology in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Nedra Lee examines the intersection of race and class in the lives of African Americans during the 19th and 20th centuries. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lee.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who is hanging in here with us tonight and that is attending. So I'm going to start by just saying that when the MFA actually asked me to come and speak about my experiences teaching about ancient Nubia, initially I was very apprehensive. And I was apprehensive because as an African diaspora archaeologist, my work primarily focuses on African Americans, and as Dalia said, following the abolition of slavery. And Nubia consequently falls outside of my chronological and topical expertise. My research examines the ways that freed Blacks, particularly Black landowners, negotiated race and class tensions during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow periods. And one of the central questions that I'm actually interested in are the ways that freed Black people begin to shape new identities for themselves, new identities which included citizen, free man, free woman, sometimes an identity that would be marked just by the adoption of a last name but did not include the name of their former enslaver. This research foregrounds race, and conceptually, notions of race and class are rather anachronistic and inapplicable to understanding daily life in ancient Nubia. And that's because race as we know it is a modern invention, and class, as we've come to understand it from the Marxist perspective, and for those of you who have questions about that, we can talk about what that means in terms of the relationship to the means of production. That also is a modern invention too. However, when you dig a little bit deeper, Nubia is not so distantly related to my research as we oftentimes, or as I personally presumed. And that's because my work broadly seeks, as I just mentioned, to understand how free Black people are trying to define themselves independently of a racist ideology that prevailed during the 19th and 20th centuries. In terms of my research, and when you think about this, especially in New England, we actually get examples of free Black communities. We see it right here in Boston on the Black community that once lived on Beacon Hill. We see it on Nantucket. We see it in Philadelphia. We see it in New York, where free Black people during the 19th century referenced a very rich African heritage when naming their important institutions in their communities, institutions like churches and schools. I'm particularly grateful, however, for my teaching to actually help me make connections to understanding the significance to that. And in recent years, I've started teaching an African diaspora archaeology class. And in this class, the first modules seek to define what is the African diaspora. And what we take from that is that the African diaspora, and specifically Africa as a place, a historical place, a geographic place, but specifically a place that is ancient in its history, is particularly important to the ways that people, Black people, both in the past and present, define themselves. In particular, ancient civilizations like Egypt, like Ethiopia, and Nubia are particularly important to efforts to construct a proud African heritage that challenges depictions of Africa as either dark or primitive, but most importantly, an idea of Africa that only has its history beginning with the advent of European contact and colonization. In these portrayals, we oftentimes see efforts to show Africa as a place of wealth, as a place of cultural sophistication, and a place that is at the epicenter of political and economic networks that cross its geographic borders. In turn, this work has actually been really significant to fostering a Pan-African project and identity that links Africans' ancient past with continued calls and expressions of Black self-determination. And this is just when we're talking about the 19th and 20th century. We haven't even begun to get into the 21st century. Such demonstrations have actually been really important in my teaching, because what they've been really important to showing me and ultimately showing my students is that history matters, and that the ways that history is written and represented matters. It matters to how communities construct ties of belonging, and it matters to how they ultimately assert their politics, their efforts to mobilize and unify. When teaching, I've enjoyed demonstrating to my students that Black leaders, artists, and writers, and many of the Black artists have been featured in Mr. Gaither's talk earlier. However, we have people like David Walker, W.B. Du Bois in 1915 in his book, The Negro. But many of these writers are ultimately seeking to excavate, both archaeologically and through literature and history, Africa's ancient history to show its long contributions to the world. But most importantly, they've been ultimately trying to show the ways that Blackness also varied and its meaning changed throughout time. However, there have been challenges in these efforts to talk about Nubia and to talk about the ways that Africa and the meaning of Africa has changed in conceptions of an African or Black political identity over time. The first challenge has been a tendency to over-romanticize and to be too myopic. Africa is a big continent with a very, very, very deep history. And we oftentimes ignore the fact that there are many other civilizations that must be and should be understood when talking about the formation of identity. Civilizations or sites like Great Zimbabwe, Timbuktu, Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. An over-reliance in reference to both to Egypt and oftentimes Nubia have overshadowed these civilizations, which were located in Western and Southern Africa. They've also led to static conceptions of African culture and history, especially when beginning to think about the ways that Blackness becomes employed or deployed in socio-political discourse. The second challenge has been efforts to define race in relationship to the African diaspora. Modern notions of the African diaspora foreground the transatlantic slave trade and both the dispersal of people of African descent and also as an important event in the unifying in their connection. Historian Colin Palmer has identified 6 streams within the history of the African diaspora. And within these 6 streams, he's distinguished the ways that notions of Blackness potentially may have changed over this time. However, trying to pinpoint the ways that Blackness actually, the way that it was defined, is a muddy and very complex process. Questions such as whether or not Blackness is an ontological condition even in the ancient world, or if Africa and Black should even be conflated, are questions that oftentimes abound both for my students and also for myself. We also wonder about the cultural and historical contextual information that is necessary to tease this out. Archaeology is rather essential to identifying the necessary context to resolving such questions or conundrums. However, the chronological parameters and aims, political aims of African diaspora archaeology, and specifically when we're talking about this, African diaspora archaeology is a largely Western-focused, modern world-centered, and what I mean by that is in terms of the 1400s and onwards, enterprise, and one of its main goals is actually elucidating the origins of race and the material effects of racism. However, oftentimes it is ill-suited to addressing such questions. In addition, disciplines like African diaspora archaeology or Egyptology remain distant from each other. Now, I argue that efforts to diversify these fields are one of the sort of central ways that we can begin to address some of these questions or to resolve some of these tensions in conversations about about the meaning of Africa and current ways that we define or the ways that, I just lost my train of thought. I argue that diversifying the field is essential to answering some of these questions or filling in the gaps about how we can tease out the ways that Africa figures into conceptions of current political or Black political identity. However, in order to do this, this would require a major and a global shift in terms of the decolonization of such fields, which would require an expansion of current definitions of race and an attention to the intersecting ways that race affects how history is written and who gets to write it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nedra. May I ask our panelists to join us for a discussion? We have time for a couple of questions, and I'll be happy to walk around with the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you all very much indeed. Very interesting. I wonder what surprises you may have had as you got into learning about this history. Have there been any surprises for you, rich as your own experiences, each of you? I'd be curious about that.
Sure.
So I think the greatest surprise was what I was describing in my remarks about beginning to teach about ancient Nubia and seeing that there was a direct connection towards the ways that Black people in the 19th and 20th centuries were engaging with the history of Nubia and Egypt in particular. And this was actually really surprising for me, so I assigned a text last semester, and I actually will say that I've been teaching African diaspora archaeology since 2014 at UMass Boston. I would mention the discussion of Nubia, but I always would sort of shy away from the topic because I just felt like I didn't have the expertise to do it. And I assigned it a book called Reversing Cell, The History of the African Diaspora by Michael Gomez. And the first 3 chapters of this book are about antiquity in Africa. So there's a chapter on basically Blacks in the Bible, and then the next 2 chapters are about Egypt and Nubia in Ethiopia, and then the classical world. And what stood out were just the ways that people like Martin Delaney or Blyden or Du Bois were beginning to even early on go through some of the excavations of these sites and using them to challenge the ways that white archaeologists were talking about people of African descent in their work. And so it just sort of showed a savviness and a sort of criticalness, even during that time period where most of the time these scholars would have not had access to the sources to even challenge these individuals, that I thought was really relevant to my conversations. So that was actually really surprising.
I would say there are 2 things that stood out in particular. One is that we have barely scratched the surface in terms of what we can learn from documents of history, from the natural environment, from what has been left as tracers. The second thing is what you see is enormously prejudiced by what assumptions you bring to the enterprise, by the nature of your perspective. So the thing that is vitally important is that we embrace new perspectives, multiple perspectives, and accept that things are complicated and that explanations that seem too simple prove to be that way. That in fact there is an interdisciplinary aspect to living that in our own small experiences we all know, but that complexity is a complexity that I think has been true at every point of the human endeavor. So it means that even when we find a tracer that leads us to a particular conclusion, no sooner are we at that conclusion than we need to re-examine it, because some other dimensions that we may have failed to see become clear. So I think that the enterprise that we're involved in is one that requires us to constantly review what we're looking at and think about it and try to find fresh perspectives. And it demands that we keep an ear open to knowledge bearers who are not necessarily traditional scholars, but who have in fact validated their lives by living them. And those are all resources available to us and to our students for learning how to use them.
I agree wholeheartedly. Surprise, yeah, I don't, my approach is more of the discovery, is that there's so much to discover, so many layers of things that are left behind, that our ancestors have left behind all these messages in stone. They left behind their places of worship, their ideas. They've physicalized a sense of spiritual ideas, political ideas, civilization, that I just find it very exciting going through all of this and being essentially someone on the front line that's making a record of this and bringing it back to add to the corpus of things that other scholars can work with, who will not travel to these places themselves, but to give them enough information that even though they don't travel there, they have enough information to learn from, to be impressed with, and to further their scholarship. But the history of our people is amazing. But not everybody feels that way, and not everybody digs into it. But it's incredible. It's very humbling.
We have time for one more question.
Can you speak about, in the exhibit, there's a little film that loops, and it talks about how people seem to talk about Egypt as not being part of Africa, and kind of, the relationship between Nubia and Egypt, and how you see that reflected in the art, and how that's influenced your work.
Well, that is an old story. Personally, I have a problem with people who can't read maps. So, I'll sort of leave it at that. But that's a political issue why people try to detach a body of land from the continent as much as it's a political equation when people talk about black Africans. You cannot be African and not be black. And that's a political equation to accommodate the white settlers in South Africa. But it's a misnomer. So, you can sift through the BS, just because someone says it doesn't make it so, especially if the evidence is contrary to that.
One more question? Sure.
Hello, thank you very much. So I just have a question. What would you recommend we do for the American school system to acknowledge more African civilizations, especially ancient and prehistoric ones? Because I feel like that's something that we lacked in my education personally. That's super important.
That's a heavy question.
I'm sorry.
I think, but it's a good question. I think part of the best answer to that is to think about the position of curriculums that are willing to deeply engage with Black studies, but the experiences of Black people. And I would also say the ways that archaeology can be a tool in also helping tell that story. There have been the fight to actually make Black history a central, not just even a central part, but literally a part of, or a part of the national story, of the world story, has been a fight that has been going on since, I wouldn't say since the beginning of Black sort of like politics. But the best way to sort of do that would have to be recognizing that the story is integral. I think that when we begin to think about civilization beginning in Africa, that's one of the first ways that we can do that. When we start to think about the gifts that Egypt and Nubia have given us, and Ethiopia that they've given us in terms of our culture, what makes us distinctly human, those are ways to do that. But it's very much about the ways that we integrate both archaeology and race into our curriculum.
I would say that answering this question requires looking at for a moment at what school systems are. School systems are teachers who have an obligation to learn themselves and to be exploratory. Students who bring a history of many experience for whatever their number of years has been and whatever their community and family life has been. They bring that, but also they usually bring an openness to exploring because there's more of the world in front of them than behind them. There are materials, and the arena of materials is ever expanding. So part of what teachers have to do is pay attention to the materials and try to find the materials that work for the circumstance where they are. There are some built-in problems to be expected. Anytime new perspectives are introduced, they run into old established ones that are unhappy to have interlopers. Communities, for the most part, tend to be conservative because they're run by adults who are trying to recreate important pieces of the world that formed them. But that world is never going to be again. So there has to be some willingness to engage a certain amount of tension. Now, people don't like tension very much and often speak of how we ought to get rid of it. But if you want an environment that's free of tension, you want heaven. And the price of heaven is you have to die to go there. So for those of us who want to address living, we have to take all of those things and say, this is what I have in front of me as material. And these are the viewpoints that come to me from the socio-political context of family, community, and issues in the larger world. And from there, you guide your struggle. Because no matter which direction you go, unless that direction is capitulation, it will be a direction of struggle.
Exactly. And I'd like to add is that, I think that in education in this country, we do a real disservice to the population because our history is based upon winners and losers, winning rather than total history. And it encourages a sort of fossilization of old stuff that doesn't absorb new stuff and doesn't get rid of stuff that should be gotten rid of. But it's for, I think, the energy of the young people who have now seen that the world is much broader than how we've been taught to push, because we're old. We don't have but it needs energy. It needs, people who are getting it. We need the energy of the young to charge ahead and enforce the changes, to break this fossilized view apart, and so that we become more representative of what we are. We humans have a great history, and it's not about just winning and losing. There's about contributions, and we should be aware of that, just like we should be aware of other languages too, but that's another issue.
Can I just say something? I think in many ways, to pick up with what you're saying, it's up to you all to build a counter canon. Yeah. That's really and when you think about the introduction of new thoughts, and dare I say, radical thoughts, the idea of, making an exhibition that is actually trying to reinterpret the ways that Nubia is, even sort of being displayed at the museum, or foregrounding issues of colonization and race. That is the beginnings of a counter canon. It's a new thought. And part of what's happening here is trying to train young people, and also not just young people, but educators and folks from all walks of life, to actually build something that is going to push up and rage against a big machine that seems overwhelming, but that can be challenged, maybe dismantled.
Accountability.
I want to make a short note on your question, a comment from earlier about Egyptians and Nubians. Just to say that Egypt and Nubia have been on that Nile for millennia. And to speak of one without speaking of the other is nonsense. Everyone knows when you have neighbors for a long time, whether you like them or not, you get involved with them. Everyone knows that the boundaries between cultures that coexist for a long time are porous. So we should really think about these things in terms of how they are full of surprises, of this thing that got taken and grew in the other place. But it didn't start from there. And that kind of reciprocity in human civilization is nobody's monopoly and everybody's commonwealth. So I think that's a useful way to think about the stretch from the Blue Nile to the Mediterranean, or from the White Nile to Khartoum, is to see this as a great artery that provides nutrients in both directions for the whole of the history of that part of the world.
That's okay. And on that note of connectivity, thank you so much for being here.